Abandoned pregnant at the altar, she disappears without a trace. When she returns years later, she is unrecognizable and powerful. The man who humiliated her is in shock. But the secret she carries with her is capable of destroying everything he has built. Before you watch, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are from so we can deliver even more videos to you. It's a lie! Louisa's scream exploded in the cathedral like thunder as she threw her bouquet into the first row of guests. The white orchids scattered in the air like shrapnel from a bomb. The golden envelope trembled in the hand of the messenger who took a step back, intimidated by the fury in her eyes. In a quick motion, Louisa advanced, snatching it from his hands and tearing it with savage violence. The golden fragments floated around her as she read the message, her entire body trembling like a violin string about to snap. "Show me," she demanded, advancing towards the group of guests who were clustered around a cell phone. The image on the screen was crystal clear. Richard and Juliana on the yacht, glasses raised in a toast, the cruel caption announcing, "Finally free to live my true love." With a roar that didn't seem human, Louisa grabbed the device and threw it against the centuries-old stained glass window, shattering both in an explosion of colored glass. The photographers advanced like hyenas, their flashes firing mercilessly. In a single fluid motion, she tore off her veil and her sapphire brooch, turning the latter into a projectile that hit the nearest lens. "Get out of my way!" she screamed, pushing away guests who were trying to approach, some with false concern, others with morbid curiosity. Her fingers worked furiously at the ties of her dress, loosening it enough to allow her to run. With a final look at Richard's mother, who was now openly smiling, Louisa shot down the central aisle, knocking over floral arrangements and candelabras, creating a chaos of flowers, wax, and fire that followed her like the tail of a vengeful comet. In the front row, Richard's mother, impeccable in her Chanel suit, displayed a triumphant smile. She had never fully approved of her son's choice, but she masterfully kept up appearances. On the other side, the empty seat where her best friend since childhood, Juliana, should have been, now made a terrible sense. Moments before, when the messenger in the gray suit had approached with the golden envelope bearing the Montero family crest, her heart had raced, but not with anxiety. Something in that man's expression had frozen her blood. "Miss Louisa?" he had asked in a low voice, holding out the envelope she had now torn with fury. A single sentence, written in a calligraphy she would recognize among 1,000. "Forgive me, but I cannot do this." The world around her fell silent. Fragments of conversations cut through the air. Abandoned. Scandal. The pregnancy. A setup. In the front row, Richard's mother was now openly smiling, without disguising her triumph. Next to her, an elderly aunt whispered, "I knew he wouldn't go through with it. A Montero doesn't mix with just anyone." It was then that the event coordinator approached, pale, showing her the screen of his cell phone. An Instagram notification. Richard Montero tagged in a newly posted photo. There, in high definition, her fiancé was smiling on the deck of his private yacht. Beside him, radiant in a golden bikini, Juliana raised a glass of champagne. The caption, "Starting a new life with who really matters." The cell phone slipped from the coordinator's hands, shattering on the marble floor. Louisa felt the first spasm of pain tear through her belly. Her hand instinctively protected her stomach as tears finally broke the dam of shock. The voices around her turned into white noise. Flashes fired. The Montero family photographers, hired to document the social event of the year, were now capturing her most vulnerable moment. Breathing with difficulty, Louisa did the only thing she could. She fled. The satin heels echoed down the cathedral's central aisle, her 6-meter veil dragging behind her like a cloud of disillusionment. The massive oak doors seemed to weigh tons when she pushed them into the merciless midday light. The dress, once a silk dream, was now suffocating every inch of her body. The perfect makeup, the work of 3 hours in the hands of the country's most sought-after makeup artist, now formed black rivers running down her cheeks. But nothing, absolutely nothing, hurt more than the sudden realization. The 2 people she loved most in the world had meticulously planned her public humiliation. "Miss, the car is ready," the driver said, opening the door of the limousine that was supposed to take them as newlyweds to the airport, where the Montero's private jet awaited them for their honeymoon in the Maldives. "Take me anywhere far from here," she whispered, collapsing into the leather seat. During the ride, her cell phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Notifications, messages, calls. The canceled wedding was already headline news on every gossip portal. Videos of her desperate escape were circulating on social media with cruel captions. Pregnant and abandoned, the belly scam that went wrong. In the gloom of the back seat, protected only by the tinted windows, Louisa felt something break inside her. It wasn't just her heart broken by the double disloyalty. It was something deeper, as if the very essence of who she believed she was being forcibly redrawn. The naive girl from the countryside died there, giving way to a woman who did not yet know her own strength. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked again. With a surprisingly firm voice, she replied, "Bus terminal, please." Her apartment was an engagement gift from Richard. Her job, an arranged position in the administration of one of his restaurants. Everything she owned in the capital was linked to the man who had just destroyed her world. She needed to start from scratch. As the limousine crossed the city, Louisa looked out the window at the streets she had learned to call home. The contrast between the mirrored skyscrapers and the emptiness that now inhabited her chest seemed like a cruel metaphor. 2 years before, she had arrived there full of dreams, believing in the promise of eternal love. Now, she was leaving, carrying only the life in her womb and a nascent determination she didn't yet fully comprehend. Upon arriving at the terminal, she ignored the curious stares her wedding dress attracted. With the few coins she had in her small party purse, she bought a ticket to the North Coast. She hadn't visited her Aunt Amelia, a distant relative who ran a small seaside guest house, in years. They didn't have frequent contact, but Louisa remembered the stories her mother told about her great-aunt, a strong woman who had rebuilt her life after losing everything. In the terminal's public restroom, Louisa faced her reflection for the first time since fleeing the cathedral. Her eyes were swollen, her makeup smeared, her hair undone. She turned on the faucet and let the cold water wash away the last traces of what should have been the happiest day of her life. Carefully, she removed the sapphire brooch from her dress, the only truly personal item she had at that moment. She put it in her pocket and, in a symbolic gesture, washed her face, erasing the social mask she had worn for 2 years, trying to fit into a world that never truly accepted her. When she looked up at the mirror again, something had changed. A spark, still timid, glowed in the depths of her gaze. It wasn't anger, although the pain still pulsed with every beat of her heart. It was something more powerful, the seed of determination that had always been part of her nature, now awakening with renewed force. "We're going to start over," she whispered to her belly. "Just you and me." On the bus that would take her away from the capital, Louisa watched the city shrink behind her through the window. The wedding dress, folded on the seat beside her, seemed like a white ghost of empty promises. Her hand found her belly again, where her true treasure grew protected. Her fingers brushed the small inner pocket where she had kept the sapphire brooch, miraculously recovered by a young nun who had found it near the broken camera lens, recognizing its sentimental value, and discreetly returned it to her as Louisa waited for the taxi. "Something tells me this is important to you," the woman had whispered, placing the brooch in her trembling hand. That small family jewel was now her only tangible link to the past she was leaving behind. The horizon began to turn orange when her cell phone vibrated with a final notification before its battery died. A message from Richard. It was for the best. "You never belonged in my world." Attached was proof of a bank deposit. The amount was huge by Louisa's standards before she met him, but a pittance for someone like Richard. Enough for the situation. A cruel euphemism for the child she was carrying. Louisa turned off her cell phone and, on an impulse, opened the bus window. The road wind whipped her face, drying her last tears. Something inside her hardened like steel being tempered in the most intense fire. 6 hours later, with the first rays of sun, the bus arrived at the small coastal town. The contrast couldn't be greater. In place of the glass and steel buildings, small, colorful houses, and the infinite sea on the horizon. Simple people started their workday, oblivious to the drama the newcomer brought with her. With the wedding dress folded in a paper bag and the satin shoes replaced by slippers bought at the bus station, Louisa walked down the main street, asking for the Maresia guest house. With every step, she felt the weight of her new reality, but also a strange lightness. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't have to be the polished version of herself that Richard and his family expected. She could simply be Louisa, with all her raw strength and imperfections. When she finally spotted the faded sign of the guest house on the quietest beach, something lit up in her chest, an almost forgotten sense of belonging. The smell of sea spray mixed with the aroma of fresh bread coming from the small yellow 2-story building brought an inexplicable nostalgia. On the porch, an elderly lady with white hair was arranging flower pots. Even after so many years, Louisa immediately recognized the precise gestures, the erect posture, the silent dignity of Aunt Amelia. "Aunt!" she called, her voice trembling. The woman turned slowly. Her eyes, a deep blue like the sea in the background, widened in recognition and then softened in instant understanding. Without unnecessary words, she opened her arms, and there, in the embrace of that woman she barely knew, but with whom she shared blood and stories, Louisa finally broke down. They were no longer tears of humiliation or loss, but of relief, as if, after swimming against the current, she had finally found a safe shore. "You're home now, child?" Aunt Amelia whispered, stroking her hair. "And here we rebuild what was broken." In that moment, as the sun rose completely over the infinite ocean, something also dawned inside Louisa, a silent promise to herself and to the child she was carrying. The pain of that day would not be in vain. She would use every tear shed in the cathedral as fuel to build a future so grand that one day those who belittled her would have to recognize her worth. The path would be arduous. The longing for what never truly existed would still hurt for a long time. But there, in that small seaside town, with the sound of the waves as a witness, the first chapter of her true story began. The first rays of sun filtered through the faded lace curtains, drawing dancing patterns on the light blue wall. Louisa opened her eyes slowly, that brief moment of peace before memory returned with all its force. For an instant, she didn't know where she was. Then, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the distant sound of the waves brought her back to reality. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival at the Maresia guest house. 3 weeks of sleeping in the same simple room, waking up with the same tightness in her chest, followed by the same silent question. How to rebuild a life from rubble? With effort, she sat up in bed, stroking the small bump on her belly that was growing every day. "Good morning, little miracle," she whispered, as she did every morning. That life inside her was her compass, her purpose, the only constant in a world that had crumbled. Outside the room, she heard the light footsteps of Aunt Amelia, who had been up for hours. At 89 years old, the woman maintained the vitality and discipline acquired in decades of working in professional kitchens. Louisa was still surprised by her aunt's energy, who managed the small 5-room guest house alone, personally cooking for the guests and taking care of the herb garden that grew in the back of the property. "Did you sleep well, dear?" Aunt Amelia asked when Louisa entered the cozy kitchen. "The baby has been restless lately," she replied, accepting the cup of lemon balm tea her aunt offered her. No coffee. Aunt Amelia was strict about prenatal care. The elderly woman smiled, her blue eyes shining with a wisdom that only years could provide. "Children feel everything: pain, joy, uncertainty, but they also feel determination. And you, my child, have more strength than you imagine." Louisa watched her aunt as she moved gracefully around the small kitchen, preparing breakfast for the 2 couples staying at the guest house. There was something almost hypnotic in the way her wrinkled hands worked the bread dough, with precise movements that spoke of years of practice. "How did you know you would be able to start over, Aunt, after everything?" Louisa still didn't know her great-aunt's whole story, only fragments shared during those weeks. Amelia stopped for a moment. Her eyes lost themselves somewhere in the past. "When I lost everything, I only had my hands, and the knowledge in here," she replied, touching her own forehead. "No one can take that from you. What we learn, what we create, that is ours forever." She turned to her great niece with a renewed look of determination. "And now, no more looking back. There is work to be done. The Cardosos ordered my special fish for lunch, and you are going to help me." In the days that followed, Louisa plunged into the guest house's routine, as if clinging to a lifeline. There was something therapeutic in the simplicity of those daily tasks: changing linens, arranging fresh flowers in the rooms, preparing breakfast for the guests. Small acts of creation and care that, little by little, filled the emptiness in her chest. But it was in the kitchen, by her aunt's side, that Louisa truly found herself. She watched, fascinated, as her aunt transformed simple ingredients into dishes that drew sighs of pleasure from the guests. It wasn't just technique, it was a deep knowledge of food, an almost religious respect for local ingredients, an intuitive understanding of flavor combinations that no culinary school could teach. "Where did you learn all this, Aunt?" she asked one night, as she helped the old woman prepare a tangerine sauce to accompany the next day's fish. The old woman was silent for a moment, as if weighing her words. "I worked for almost 3 decades in the Montero's house in Sao Paulo." Louisa froze, the wooden spoon suspended in the air. "Montero? As in—" "Yes, the same family," her aunt confirmed. "I was their private chef for years, before they opened their first restaurant. Those recipes that made the family famous came from these hands." She held up her wrinkled hands, marked by small scars from burns and cuts, medals of a life dedicated to cooking. "But why did you leave? Why did you never get the recognition?" The old woman's face hardened for an instant. "Some stories are for another time, dear. What matters is that I brought with me what is truly valuable: my knowledge, my recipes." That night, Louisa had a hard time sleeping. Her aunt's words echoed in her mind, connecting points of a larger story that was beginning to reveal itself. There was something almost poetic in the fact that both of them had been, in some way, marked by the same family. The weeks turned into months, and Louisa's belly grew along with her adaptation to that new life. Little by little, the nightmares in which she fled the cathedral became less frequent. The faces of Richard and Juliana began to fade in her memory, like old photographs exposed to the sun. On a particularly stormy afternoon, when the rough sea drove tourists away and the intense rain beat against the guest house windows, Aunt Amelia called Louisa to the small attic. "I want to show you something," she said, turning on the yellowish light of the cramped room, filled with boxes and old objects. With difficulty, she dragged a dark wooden chest to the center of the space. The lock, rusted by time, gave way with a creak when she turned the small key. Inside, dozens of leather-bound notebooks were meticulously organized. "My recipes," Amelia explained, stroking the covers as if they were sacred relics. "Every dish I created, every technique I perfected, it's all here." Louisa opened one of the notebooks with reverence. The yellowed pages were filled with elegant calligraphy, diagrams of dish assembly, and notes on flavor combinations. More than recipes, they were records of a life dedicated to the culinary arts. Between the notebooks, there were envelopes with letters, old photographs, and newspaper clippings. One of them contained a story about the inauguration of the first Montero restaurant in 1908. In the black and white photo, the family patriarch posed proudly beside the dishes that would become legendary. In the corners of the image, almost imperceptible, a much younger Amelia was watching the scene. Her face was a mixture of pride and melancholy. "They never mentioned your name," Louisa whispered, indignation growing in her chest. Amelia smiled with serenity. "External recognition is fleeting, dear. True value is in what we create, not in what others say about our creation." That discovery changed something fundamental in Louisa. It wasn't just the historical connection between her aunt and her ex-fiancé's family that impacted her, but the dignity with which Amelia carried her story. There was no bitterness in her eyes when she spoke of the past, only the quiet certainty of her own worth. In the following weeks, while the storm kept the small town isolated, Louisa immersed herself in her aunt's notebooks. She studied each recipe, each technique, marveling at the precision and creativity documented in those pages. At night, she experimented with reproducing the dishes in the guesthouse kitchen, under Amelia's watchful and proud eye. It was during this period that the idea was born. It all started when Louisa discovered a set of recipes for preserves made with the Jussara palm fruit, a traditional ingredient of the region that was becoming increasingly rare due to predatory extraction. "We could adapt these recipes," Amelia suggested one night, as they sipped an herbal tea from the garden. "Make artisanal preserves to sell to tourists, something that tells a story." "Your story, Aunt." The old woman's eyes shone. "I always knew you had an instinct, girl. It's not just about food. It's about preserving traditions, honoring ingredients, telling stories through flavors." That with the savings Amelia had kept over the years and a small portion of the money Richard had transferred, Louisa had anonymously donated the rest to a shelter for single mothers. They began to plan the small business. The first challenge came when they tried to buy the Jussara fruit from local producers. The fishermen and farmers of the region, accustomed to selling only to known middlemen, looked with suspicion at that girl from the city, with her pregnant belly and ambitious ideas. "We don't sell to just anyone," said Mr. Jerome dryly, patriarch of the family that controlled most of the Jussara harvest. "These techniques have been passed down from father to son for generations. What does an outsider know about that?" Instead of being discouraged, Louisa saw an opportunity. In the following weeks, she woke up before dawn to accompany the fishermen in their work, learned about the tides and seasons from the elders, and offered to help with community tasks. It was not a calculated strategy. There was a genuine curiosity and respect for the traditional knowledge of those people. Little by little, doors began to open. The first victory came when Donna Zena, Mr. Jerome's wife, tasted the Jusara cake Louisa had prepared following one of Amelia's recipes. "Girl, who taught you to balance the tartness of the fruit like that?" the woman asked, eyes wide with surprise. "My great-aunt," Louisa replied with pride. "She says every ingredient has a soul, and our job is simply to honor it." Donna Zena nodded, a silent understanding passing between the two women. The next day, Mr. Jerome appeared at the guest house with a small shipment of Jusara. "To get you started," he said simply. "Show me what you can do with it." The first preserves were born on humid afternoons of experiments in the guest house kitchen. Louisa adapted Amelia's old recipes using traditional preservation techniques, but adding contemporary touches to the flavor combinations. The final product was as beautiful as it was delicious. Elegant jars containing the purple Jusara pulp transformed into jellies, sauces, and preserves that enhanced the unique flavor of the fruit. Each jar received an artisanal, handwritten label, briefly telling the story of that ingredient and its importance to the local culture. When her belly already announced the 7th month of pregnancy, Louisa sold her first jars at the farmer's market in the neighboring town. The response was immediate. Tourists and locals were delighted not only with the flavor, but with the story behind those products. "It's more than food," Louisa explained to a customer as she carefully packed a set of preserves. "It's cultural preservation, its connection to the land, its respect for natural cycles." She returned to the guest house that day with a light heart and slightly fuller pockets. She found Aunt Amelia on the porch, contemplating the sunset over the sea. "I knew you would find your way, child," Amelia announced, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky met the ocean. "Sometimes we have to lose everything to find out what truly matters." Louisa took her aunt's wrinkled hand in hers. "Thank you for taking me in, for sharing your wisdom. I don't know what I would have done without you." "You would have found strength within yourself, as you always have," Amelia replied with simplicity. "But I'm happy we are together on this journey." That night, lying in her bed, as she felt the baby's restless movements, Louisa thought about how life had unexpected paths. 6 months earlier, she had been at the altar of a cathedral, dressed in Italian silk, about to join one of the country's most powerful families. Now, she was in a simple room of a seaside guest house, with her hands smelling of Jusara and her heart filled with a peace she didn't know. She remembered her mother's words, who had passed away so many years ago. "Life rarely takes us on the easiest path, but always on the path we need to take." At the time, she hadn't understood the meaning of that phrase. Now, stroking her belly as she listened to the sound of the waves outside, she was beginning to understand. The abandonment at the altar, which had seemed like the end of everything, was now revealing itself as the true beginning. Not the beginning she had planned, but perhaps the beginning that was always destined for her. A path of self-discovery, of connection with her roots, of creating something genuinely hers. "We're planting seeds now," she whispered to the baby moving in her womb, "and together we will see the harvest." Outside, the rain began again, a tropical storm that washed the earth with promises of renewal. Louisa fell asleep to the sound of raindrops on the roof, dreaming of purple fruits that grew on tall palms, and of wrinkled hands that taught hers to create beauty from the simplest of ingredients. The scream tore through the pre-dawn as lightning cuts through the sky. Aunt Amelia, who was dozing in the chair beside the bed, woke with a start. The midwife, Donna Clara, the most experienced in the region, maintained a serene expression despite the sweat that ran down her forehead. "It's almost here, my child. Just a little more," the woman encouraged, her calloused hands positioned with the precision of one who had brought hundreds of lives into the world. Louisa bit the sheet, holding back another scream. After 18 hours of labor, her strength was ebbing like the low tide. The pain was different from anything she had ever felt, not just physical, but primal, connecting her to all the women who had come before her. "I can't do it anymore," she whispered, tears mixing with sweat. Aunt Amelia approached, holding her hand with surprising firmness for a woman of nearly 90. "Yes, you can. We, the women of our family, are like the Jusara, hard to break, impossible to uproot." But something in those words ignited a last reserve of strength inside Louisa. With a cry that seemed to carry not only the pain of childbirth, but all the hurt from the past few months, she gave the final push. The sharp cry of the child filled the simple room, overpowering the sound of the rain drumming on the old tile roof. Donna Clara held up the small child, still connected to her mother by the umbilical cord. "A girl," she announced, with a smile that lit up her tired face. "Strong and perfect like her mother." When they finally placed the small bundle in her arms, Louisa felt the world around her disappear. There was only her and that tiny being, with reddish skin and swollen eyes, who were trying to open to the first light of life. "Hello, Victoria," she whispered, the name escaping her lips without having planned it. "My little Victoria." Aunt Amelia, watching the scene with teary eyes, nodded in silent approval. In that moment, as the storm outside subsided and the first rays of sun filtered through the cracks in the window, not only was a child born, but a mother was born as well. And with her, a determination that would change the course of many lives. The first few months with Victoria were a blur of sleepless nights, breastfeeding, diapers, and an exhaustion that Louisa had never imagined possible. The small room in the guest house became an entire universe, where time was measured by feedings and brief moments of sleep. But even in the midst of the whirlwind of recent motherhood, the Jusara preserves didn't leave her mind. When Victoria was 2 months old, Louisa began to resume production, taking advantage of the rare moments when the baby was sleeping. "You need to rest too," Aunt Amelia insisted, finding her in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, sterilizing jars while rocking the baby's car seat with her foot. "I'm resting at my own pace," Louisa responded, with a tired smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Besides, every jar sold is a step toward her future." Aunt Amelia didn't insist. She knew that look well, the same one she herself had decades ago when she had to start from scratch. She knew that inner strength, that almost stubborn determination, was what kept Louisa on her feet when everything around her seemed to conspire to bring her down. As Victoria grew, it became easier to establish a routine. At 6 months, the girl was already sitting alone on a blanket in the kitchen, watching with curious eyes as her mother worked. At 9, she clapped with excitement when she tasted small spoonfuls of the less acidic compots. "She has a refined palate," commented Mr. Jerome, who now regularly supplied Jusara fruits to Louisa. The old fisherman had become a constant presence in their lives, bringing not only ingredients, but also stories and the wisdom of one who had lived an entire life in harmony with natural cycles. It was he who suggested that Louisa expand the product line, including other native fruits from the Atlantic forest. "What you do with the Jusara, girl, is a rescue. But there are other treasures in this forest that deserve the same care." When Victoria turned 1, celebrated with a small party on the guest house porch, where local residents brought simple handmade gifts, the production already included kombucha jellies, uvaya compotes, and sweet and sour Araxa sauces, all with the same artisanal care and respect for the ingredients that had made the Jusara preserves a local success. The business grew slowly, but with solid foundations. The products were now sold not only at the local market, but also in small natural food stores in neighboring towns. Tourists who stayed at Aunt Amelia's guest house returned home carrying boxes of the delicate preserves, spreading the fame of those unique flavors beyond the coastal borders. But growth brought new challenges. Reconciling the growing production with the care of a child who was crawling through the house, exploring every corner with insatiable curiosity, tested Louisa's limits daily. "You don't have to do everything alone," Aunt Amelia reminded her. "This community is your family now." In fact, an informal support system had formed around them. Donna Zena would come some afternoons to play with Victoria, while Louisa prepared a new batch of preserves. Mr. Jerome's daughter, a teacher at the local school, would bring books and songs to stimulate the girls' development. Even the baker, a shy young man who had recently returned to the city after trying to make a life for himself in the capital, offered to deliver the products to neighboring towns during his distribution routes. When Victoria turned 1.5, Louisa's small business had an official name: Sabores de Maresia, flavors of the sea spray, and a loyal clientele that anxiously awaited each new batch. But the intense pace took its toll. That morning, preparing for the regional artisanal producers' fair that would take place in the neighboring town, Louisa felt particularly exhausted. She had spent the night awake, finishing a special order for a small boutique hotel that had just opened in the region. Victoria had a slight cold, more tearful than usual, and even the strong coffee that Louisa had taken in generous doses could not ward off the dizziness that had accompanied her since waking up. "Maybe we should stay home today," Aunt Amelia suggested, noticing the paleness on her great-niece's face. "I can't miss this fair," Louisa replied, organizing the products in the small van she had rented for the occasion. "It's the largest in the region, with buyers from all over the state. This could be our big break." The regional fair was indeed an important event. Held only twice a year, it brought together artisanal producers from different locations, attracting not only regular consumers, but also chefs and buyers from specialized restaurants and emporiums. Under the relentless sun of that summer morning, Louisa set up her stall with the help of Donna Zena, who had offered to help with Victoria. The girl, with her large, curious eyes that resembled her mother's, watched everything from her stroller, occasionally letting out giggles that attracted smiles from passers-by. The first hours were promising. Louisa's products, with their impeccable presentation and unique flavors, stood out among the fair's offerings. A constant line formed in front of her stall as she patiently explained the production process, the origin of the ingredients, and the story behind each recipe. It was around noon, when the heat was at its peak, that Louisa felt the first strong wave of dizziness. The world around her seemed to spin. The voices became distant, as if they were coming through a tunnel. She grabbed onto the table to keep her balance, accidentally knocking over one of the sample jars. "Are you okay, dear?" asked a woman who was waiting to be served. Louisa tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. The last thing she saw before darkness took over was the alarmed face of Donna Zena and Victoria, extending her little arms toward her, as if she sensed that something was wrong with her mother. When she opened her eyes again, she was lying in the shade of a tree, away from the bustle of the fair. A man she didn't know was kneeling beside her, holding her pulse with precise fingers. Victoria was crying in Donna Zena's arms, who was trying to calm her. "She's awake!" the old woman exclaimed, approaching with the child. The man smiled, gently releasing Louisa's wrist. "Welcome back. You gave us a scare." Trying to sit up, Louisa felt a new wave of dizziness. "Victoria, she's fine," the stranger assured her in a calm voice. "But you need to rest. Severe exhaustion, dehydration, probably inadequate diet. Your body is sending clear warning signs." Something about the way he spoke, the precision of the terms, the gentle authority, made Louisa ask, "Are you a doctor?" He laughed, a surprisingly melodic sound. "Chef, Gabriel Miller. But I've spent enough time in professional kitchens to recognize the signs of someone who is pushing themselves beyond their limit." The name lit up a flash of recognition in Louisa's eyes. Gabriel Miller, one of the most respected chefs in the country, known for his work with native Brazilian ingredients and for his fierce criticism of the artificiality of contemporary haute cuisine. "Your products are extraordinary," he continued, helping her to sit up slowly. "I had been watching your stall for a while, fascinated not only by the flavors, but by the story you tell through them. When you fainted, I was one of the first to run to help." Louisa blushed, mortified at the thought of having caused a scene in the middle of the fair. "I'm so sorry. I don't usually—" "Don't apologize," Gabriel interrupted with gentle firmness. "The only person who deserves your apologies is yourself, for not respecting your limits." He paused, looking at Victoria, who had now calmed down and was watching the stranger with curiosity, and perhaps this little lady who needs a healthy mother. There was something in the direct way he spoke, without judgment, but without concessions, that reminded her of Aunt Amelia. Louisa felt unexpected tears well up in her eyes, not from sadness or shame, but from relief at being seen, truly seen, in her exhaustion that she was so desperately trying to hide. Donna Zena approached, handing Victoria into her mother's arms. The girl immediately nestled against Louisa's chest, her small body relaxing, as if she intuitively understood that, despite the scare, everything would be okay now. "I need to get back to the stall," Louisa said, trying to stand up. Gabriel placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Your friend has already taken care of it. The products have been safely stored," and she explained the situation to the customers. Many left orders for the next fair. He smiled. "In fact, I think your fainting ended up creating an aura of mystery around your preserves. People were even more curious." Despite the situation, Louisa couldn't help but let out a small smile. The universe had strange ways of working. "I have a proposal for you," Gabriel said, sitting on the grass beside her. "But first, I need to know more about your products, your production, your story." That afternoon, in the shade of an old mango tree, with Victoria playing peacefully on her lap, Louisa told her story to Gabriel Miller. Not all the details, nothing about Richard or the canceled wedding, but about Aunt Amelia, the rediscovered recipes, the work with local producers, and the vision of creating products that respected traditions and preserved almost forgotten flavors. Gabriel listened intently, occasionally asking precise questions about techniques or ingredients. There was a genuine respect in his curiosity, a deep understanding of the value of the knowledge Louisa was sharing. "I'm starting a new project in the capital," he finally revealed. "A restaurant different from anything I've ever done, focused on authenticity, on direct connection with small producers who work with passion and integrity, like you." His eyes shone with enthusiasm as he explained the concept, a space that would be more than a restaurant. It would be a center for research, preservation, and celebration of Brazilian food biodiversity. "I want your products as a central part of this project," he concluded, "not just to serve to customers, but to tell a story about resilience, authenticity, and respect for natural cycles." Louisa's heart raced. It was an opportunity she had never imagined possible so early in her small business. However, a concern clouded her initial enthusiasm. "My production is still small, artisanal. I don't know if I could meet the demand of a restaurant in the capital." Gabriel smiled, as if he had been expecting that objection. "We would start slowly, respecting your pace and your philosophy. Quality is what matters, not quantity. And I have the resources to help you expand gradually, maintaining the essence of what makes your product special." Louisa thought of Aunt Amelia, of how she would react to that proposal. She thought of Victoria, of the future she dreamed of building for her daughter. She thought of the small community that had welcomed her and now was an integral part of her work. "I need to talk to my aunt with the local producers. I can't make a decision like this alone." Gabriel nodded respectfully. "Naturally, but there's one more thing I need to mention." His face took on a more serious expression. "If we agree to this partnership, I suggest you keep your identity protected, at least initially." Louisa frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "The world of gastronomy can be merciless," he explained, "especially with stories like yours. A young single mother struggling to build a business from scratch. It would be very easy for the media to turn it into a sentimental narrative, exploiting your image instead of valuing your work on its own merits." A cold shiver ran down Louisa's spine. The idea of having her personal life exposed, of being reduced to a story of overcoming adversity to sell magazines or generate clicks, was deeply unsettling. "You would stay in the background," Gabriel continued. "I would be the public face of the partnership, while you would maintain total creative control over the products. When the time is right, when your work is firmly established by its intrinsic value, then you decide if you want to reveal your identity." Looking at Victoria, who had fallen asleep on her lap, Louisa felt an unusual clarity. Gabriel's proposal wasn't just a business opportunity. It was a chance to build something meaningful while protecting what she held most precious, her daughter and her dignity. "I'll think about it," she responded with a renewed determination in her voice, as the sun began to set on the horizon, tinging the regional fair with golden tones. Louisa felt that fainting spell, that moment of public vulnerability that had so embarrassed her, could be the beginning of something much bigger than she had ever dared to dream. The scissors slid through the last lock of Louisa's brown hair, which fell in slow motion to the floor of the makeshift salon. Victoria, now 2.5 years old, watched fascinated from Aunt Amelia's lap as her mother emerged like a phoenix from the ashes of her old self. "They wouldn't recognize you, even if they looked twice," affirmed Cecilia, the hairdresser who had come from the capital at Gabriel's request. Her skilled hands had transformed Louisa's long, wavy hair into a modern, asymmetrical cut, now dyed a platinum blonde that contrasted dramatically with her naturally tanned skin. Louisa contemplated her reflection, feeling a strange mix of power and melancholy. The woman in the mirror seemed like a stranger, sophisticated, mysterious, with more defined cheekbones, after the subtle cosmetic treatments she had undergone in recent months, also part of Gabriel's meticulous plan. "What do you think, little one?" Louisa asked, turning to her daughter, who stared at her with wide eyes. "You're not Mommy?" Victoria replied, hiding her face in her great-aunt's shoulder. Everyone laughed, but the comment reverberated inside Louisa like an echo in an empty cave. "You're not Mommy." Perhaps that was exactly the goal, to become someone else, someone who would never be recognized as the girl abandoned at the altar, humiliated in front of 300 people, and the tabloids that still, occasionally, resurrected the story when there was no other news. "It's just the beginning of the transformation," Gabriel reminded her, watching from the doorway of the small guest house room, now converted into a beauty studio. "We still have the voice consultant arriving tomorrow and the behavior specialist next week." 18 months had passed since the fainting spell at the regional fair and Gabriel Miller's unexpected proposal. What had started as a small partnership, the exclusive supply of Louisa's artisanal preserves to the chef's new restaurant, had transformed into a much broader and more ambitious project. "I've scheduled Botox for next week," Gabriel continued, consulting his phone. "Nothing exaggerated, just enough to slightly alter your most recognizable features. People who knew you at a glance will hardly make the connection." Louisa nodded, watching the locks of hair on the floor, physical fragments of an identity she was slowly leaving behind. The metamorphosis was not just physical. During those months, as the business grew under Gabriel's strategic guidance, something inside her was also transforming. "I have a gift for you," Gabriel announced, handing her an elegant box. Inside, a minimalist business card with embossed gold letters. Aurora Fields, Creative Director, her new professional name, carefully chosen to symbolize rebirth. Aurora, the sunrise. Fields, a tribute to her countryside origins. "It's official then," she whispered, running her fingers over the embossed letters. "Your new life begins now," Gabriel confirmed with a satisfied smile. "Tomorrow we sign the final documents of the partnership, and next week we begin scaled production at the new kitchen." The small artisanal production that Louisa had started in Aunt Amelia's guesthouse kitchen had grown exponentially in recent months. With Gabriel's investment, it now occupied a renovated warehouse at the entrance of the city, employing 6 local women personally trained by Louisa in the techniques perfected by her great-aunt. And the business model they developed together was revolutionary in the sector. It preserved the artisanal techniques and exceptional quality, while gradually increasing the scale of production. Each jar still received individualized attention, but optimized logistical processes allowed for greater efficiency without compromising the essence of the product. "I still can't believe we managed to convince Mr. Jerome to expand the cultivation of Jussara," Louisa commented, remembering the initial resistance of the old fishermen and the other traditional producers. The turning point had happened 3 months earlier, when Gabriel had brought in expert agronomists to demonstrate how the cooperative system proposed by Louisa would not only preserve traditional techniques, but also protect the species from extinction through sustainable management practices. "You won them over with your authenticity," Gabriel replied. "I just provided the technical resources." It was true. Louisa's genuine respect for local traditions and her commitment to valuing the ancestral knowledge of that community had been decisive in overcoming the initial distrust. What had started as a small preserve operation had transformed into a project of cultural and environmental preservation that benefited dozens of families in the region. That night, after Gabriel left for the capital and Victoria fell asleep, Louisa sat on the guesthouse porch beside Aunt Amelia. The sea in the distance reflected the full moon like a liquid mirror. "Are you ready to leave this place?" the old woman asked, watching the profile of her great-niece, now so transformed. In 3 weeks, Louisa and Victoria would move to an apartment in the capital, close to the new industrial kitchen, where production would be expanded to serve not only Gabriel's restaurant, but also selected gourmet shops. It was the logical next step in the plan, but leaving the refuge that had welcomed them in their most vulnerable moment brought an unexpected sadness. "This place saved my life, Aunt," Louisa replied, her voice thick with emotion. "How can I just leave?" Amelia smiled, her blue eyes reflecting the wisdom of 9 decades of life. "Places don't save people, dear. People save people. And most importantly, people save themselves." She squeezed her great-niece's hand gently. "Besides, it's not goodbye. It's an expansion of territories." Louisa nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude so intense it almost suffocated her. Part of the agreement with Gabriel included the complete renovation of the guest house, transforming it into a small boutique hotel that would serve as a showcase for the brand's products and a center for exclusive gastronomic experiences. Aunt Amelia would remain as a culinary consultant, although the daily administration would pass into the hands of a professional manager. "We've lived many lives, haven't we?" Louisa reflected. "Sometimes I wonder if the girl who waited tables in that cafe still exists somewhere inside me." "All versions of us continue to exist," Amelia replied. "We just learn to access different facets as needed. The important thing is not to lose the essence." The launch of the Aurora brand in the capital coincided with an unexpected crisis in the organic food sector. New government regulations, implemented abruptly, imposed strict requirements that small producers could not meet. Almost overnight, the supply of quality artisanal products plummeted, while demand remained high. "This is no coincidence," Gabriel explained during a video conference, while Louisa supervised the final adjustments in the new industrial kitchen. "I've been following the processing of these regulations for almost 2 years. We knew this moment would come." The perfect timing gave the Aurora brand an extraordinary competitive advantage. While other companies struggled to adapt to the new rules, Louisa's operation had already been structured to comply with all the requirements, thanks to Gabriel's strategic foresight and the infrastructure investments they had made in advance. The inauguration of the Raízes restaurant, Roots, Gabriel's new venture that featured the Aurora preserves as the highlight of the menu, attracted gastronomic critics, influencers, and personalities from the sector. Louisa watched everything from a distance, through the security cameras installed in her room at the back of the establishment. "They are loving it," Gabriel whispered, briefly escaping the party to update her. "The Jussara sauce with the smoked fish is being called the gastronomic revelation of the year." Louisa smiled, feeling a satisfaction she had never experienced. It wasn't just commercial success. It was the validation of her work on its own merits, without her personal history or appearance interfering with the judgment. Victoria, now 3 years old, had adapted surprisingly well to life in the big city. She attended a prestigious Montessori school where no one knew her story or associated her with the scandal that involved her birth. To the outside world, she was simply the daughter of Aurora Fields, the mysterious businesswoman who was revolutionizing the artisanal preserves market. At home, however, she continued to be the daughter of Louisa, the woman who, even transformed externally, preserved the essence of who she really was for her daughter. "Mommy, why is your hair different at school?" Victoria asked one night, while Louisa was putting her to sleep. The question caught her by surprise. At 3 years old, Victoria was beginning to notice the subtle transformations that her mother made when leaving the house. The platinum wig that replaced her now short, dark hair, the contact lenses that changed the color of her eyes, the slight accent she adopted in public. "Remember the stories of Cinderella and the ugly duckling we read together?" Louisa replied, carefully choosing her words. "Sometimes we need to transform ourselves on the outside to protect who we are on the inside until we are ready to show our true form." The explanation seemed to temporarily satisfy the girl's curiosity, but Louisa knew that more complex questions would come with time. How to explain to a child that her mother lived a double life not by choice, but out of necessity? As the popularity of the Aurora brand grew, it became increasingly difficult to maintain total anonymity. Gabriel continued to be the public face of the business, giving interviews and participating in events, always presenting Aurora as a reclusive visionary obsessed with the perfection of her products. The mystery only fueled the fascination. Gastronomy magazines speculated about the true identity of the creator of the preserves that were redefining the standards of the gourmet market. Some suggested she was an international chef, operating under a pseudonym. Others, that she was an eccentric aristocrat. No one ever suspected that behind the sophisticated Aurora Fields was Louisa Silva, the girl from the countryside who 3 years earlier had been abandoned at the altar and publicly humiliated. It was on a fall afternoon, while she was distractedly flipping through a business magazine in her dermatologist's waiting room, that Louisa saw a photo that made her blood run cold. Richard Montero, visibly disheartened, leaving the bankruptcy court with his lawyer. The headline was merciless. Gastronomic empire in ruins. Montero seeks restructuring to save restaurants. With slightly trembling hands, Louisa read the article. The empire the family had built over decades was facing its worst crisis. The ambitious international expansion had coincided with the global recession, resulting in substantial losses. Added to this was the extravagant lifestyle that Richard and his wife Juliana maintained, with houses on 3 continents and a yacht that consumed a fortune in maintenance. But the fatal blow, according to the report, had been the loss of quality of the signature dishes, which made the Montero restaurants famous. After the retirement of the executive chef who, for decades, had adapted the original recipes, the establishments never regained the luster that characterized them, the text explained. Louisa closed the magazine, a whirlwind of contradictory emotions inside her. It wasn't revenge she felt. It was something more complex, a strange mixture of validation and melancholy. The universe seemed to operate with an ironic symmetry. While she was rising under a new identity, those who had discarded her were facing their own decline. That night, as Gabriel updated her on the growing sales and plans for expansion into international markets, Louisa interrupted him with a question that caught him off guard. "What if we bought the Montero restaurants?" The silence that followed was as dense as sea fog. Gabriel studied her carefully, understanding for the first time the extent of the plan that was forming in the mind of that extraordinary woman. "It would be an interesting strategic move," he finally replied, choosing his words carefully, "but also extremely personal. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Louisa walked to the window of her office, watching the city illuminated below. The metropolis that had once intimidated her now seemed like a chessboard, where she had learned to move the pieces with precision. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman that few would recognize. The flawlessly styled platinum hair, the subtly altered features from strategic procedures, the elegant posture a result of months of intensive training. "It's not about revenge," she explained, surprising herself with the calmness in her own voice. "It's about completing a cycle, about recovering something that, in truth, never truly belonged to them." Her thoughts turned to Aunt Amelia's recipe chest, now kept in a safe in her apartment. The old notebooks, the meticulous notes, the documentary evidence that the culinary creations that founded the reputation of the Montero restaurants had been born from the hands and mind of the elderly woman, who was now approaching 90. "What would your plan be?" Gabrielle questioned, intrigued by the determination he saw in her eyes. "First, we need a meeting," Louisa replied, twirling the silver ring she wore as part of her new persona. An object that symbolized her commitment, not to a man, but to the truth that would one day come to light. A meeting where, finally, Aurora Fields and Richard Montero meet face to face. That night marked the beginning of the final phase of the plan that Louisa didn't even know she was building from the day she fled the cathedral, leaving behind not only a failed marriage, but a version of herself that no longer existed. The metamorphosis was almost complete, but the story still held its climax. As she prepared for bed, She checked, as she did every night, the small velvet case where she kept the sapphire brooch, the only piece of her former life she had kept with her. It wasn't just a family jewel. It was a reminder, an anchor, and soon it would be the key that would unlock the last door of her transformation. Lying in the darkness, Louisa heard Victoria's soft breathing in the next room. The girl, who was growing strong and curious, would soon turn 4, the same amount of time that separated Louisa from that fateful afternoon in the cathedral. 4 years of rebuilding, of learning, of metamorphosis. "We're almost there, my love," she whispered to her sleeping daughter, even though she knew she couldn't hear her. "Soon, we'll get back what is rightfully ours." The skyscraper that housed the headquarters of the Montero Group no longer boasted the imposing luster of yesteryear. The mirrored windows, once impeccably gleaming, now displayed an opacity that betrayed neglected maintenance. In the lobby, where an artificial waterfall once created an ambiance of ostentatious luxury, now only a trickle of water ran between the ornamental stones, like silent tears for lost glory. Louisa, or Aurora Fields, as she was known in the business world, adjusted her perfectly cut Italian suit as she waited in the lobby. Her platinum hair was pulled into a severe bun, and lightweight glasses framed her eyes, now blue thanks to contact lenses. No one who saw her today would make any connection to the young woman humiliated at the altar 4.5 years ago. "Miss Fields, Mr. Montero will see you now," the receptionist announced with a mechanical smile that did not reach her tired eyes. The path to the president's office was a corridor of memories for Louisa. How many times had she walked that same path, holding Richard's hand, naively dreaming of the future they would build together? Now, every step on the worn carpet was a silent affirmation of her transformation. Before entering the room, she discreetly touched the small object in her inner pocket, the sapphire brooch, carefully preserved for all these years. Beside it, the original golden envelope, the same one she had received at the altar, the 2 pieces that would complete the circle of her story. "Aurora Fields," the assistant announced, opening the door to the large room Louisa knew so well. Richard stood up to greet her, and the shock was greater than she had anticipated. 4 years had taken a heavy toll on that man. His prematurely graying hair, the deep dark circles under his eyes, his slightly slumped posture, physical signs of someone who carries not only the weight of a collapsing empire, but also of choices that now proved to be wrong. "Miss Fields, it is a pleasure to finally meet you in person," he said, extending his hand. His voice, however, was still the same, the deep timbre that had once made Louisa's heart race. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Montero," she replied, with the slight European accent she had adopted as part of her new identity. "I've heard a lot about you and your company." The hesitation was intentional, a small jab that hit its target. Richard indicated the chairs around the meeting table, where 3 executives were already waiting, the last survivors of a team that had once numbered in the dozens. "As you must know, we are considering strategic proposals for restructuring," Richard explained, carefully choosing his words to avoid terms like sale or bankruptcy. "I understand perfectly," Louisa replied, opening her Italian leather briefcase. "My proposal is simple. Complete acquisition of the Montero Group's brand and operations, while maintaining the visual identity and part of the current team." The objectivity seemed to momentarily destabilize Richard. He was probably expecting preliminary negotiations, diplomatic niceties, the usual game of the corporate world. Aurora's direct approach revealed someone who didn't need to waste time with preliminaries, someone in a position of power. For the next hour, numbers were discussed, spreadsheets analyzed, and projections debated. Louisa remained imperturbable, rebutting each argument with surgical precision, demonstrating an impressive knowledge of the group's internal operations, knowledge that they attributed to her excellent research team, but which, in truth, came from her personal experience. "Our final offer is this," she concluded, sliding a document across the table. "A fair value, considering the brand's recovery potential, not its current state." Richard studied the numbers, a look of momentary relief softening his features. The proposal was generous, not enough to restore the family's fortune, but sufficient to avoid the complete humiliation of bankruptcy. "However, there is one non-negotiable condition," Louisa added, her voice taking on a firmer tone. With a calculated gesture, she asked the executives to temporarily withdraw, leaving her alone with Richard. When the door closed, the silence in the room became almost palpable. Through the window, the afternoon sun cast golden rays that illuminated particles of dust floating in the air, silent witnesses to what was about to happen. "My condition," Louisa continued, "involves the public recognition of the true creator of the signature recipes that founded the reputation of the Montero restaurants." Richard frowned, confusion evident on his face. "What are you talking about? Those recipes have been in the family for generations." With deliberately slow movements, Louisa took a set of old documents from her inner briefcase. Aunt Amelia's original notebooks, yellowed photographs, letters dated decades ago. "Amelia Suarez worked for your family for over 30 years, she explained, spreading the documents on the table. Every one of the recipes that made the Montero restaurants famous came from her hands. Every technique, every flavor combination. Richard's face paled as he examined the documents. The dates, the signatures, the meticulous records left no room for doubt. Amelia had not only created the recipes, she had methodically documented the entire process, perhaps foreseeing that one day the truth would need to come to light. "This is surprising," he stammered, running his fingers over the old notebooks. "But why do you care about this? What is your connection to this woman?" Louisa stood up slowly, circling the table as she spoke. "I believe in justice, Mr. Montero, in truth emerging, no matter how long it takes." She stopped in front of the window, watching the city below. "Amelia is 92 years old now. She is still alive to receive the recognition she deserves." Richard nodded, still stunned by the revelation. "I understand. We can incorporate this into the agreement, create some kind of tribute, maybe rename the main menu." "No!" Louisa interrupted, her voice suddenly as sharp as steel. "The recognition will be complete and public. A formal ceremony, press coverage, her name permanently featured in every establishment." Something in the intensity of her demand made Richard study her more attentively. "You speak as if this were personal, Miss Fields. Or should I say, Aurora. Is that really your name?" The moment had arrived. With deliberate slowness, Louisa took the sapphire brooch from her inner pocket, placing it on the table between them. The small object shone under the light of the setting sun, a blue beacon of shared memories. The recognition was not immediate. Richard looked at the jewel, then at Aurora's face, searching for connections in his exhausted mind. It was then that she placed the golden envelope beside the brooch, the same one he had received at the altar 4.5 years ago, carefully preserved like a talisman of transformation. Shock ran across Richard's face like lightning. His eyes widened, moving frantically between the brooch, the envelope, and the face of the woman before him, searching for traces of the woman he had once loved in the stranger in front of him. "Louisa," he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached for her platinum bun, removing it with a fluid motion to reveal her natural hair, now short and dark. She took out her blue contact lenses, revealing the brown eyes he had known so well. When she finally spoke, her voice was free of the affected accent, returning to the natural timbre he hadn't heard in almost 5 years. "Hello, Richard." The silence that followed was as thick as the air before a storm. Richard slumped into his chair, his face a mask of disbelief, shock, and something more. Shame, perhaps, or remorse. How could you? This is impossible," he stammered, his impotent gestures trying to encompass the complete transformation before him. "Impossible," Louisa repeated, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Just as it was impossible for the Montero heir to abandon his pregnant fiancée at the altar. Just as it was impossible for that fiancée to rebuild her life and create an empire of her own. Richard lowered his head, words seemingly abandoning him. When he finally looked up, his eyes were tear-filled. "I knew the truth, about the lies she told, about the manipulated messages." He swallowed hard. "I tried to find you to explain myself, but you had completely disappeared." "And the child?" he asked after a moment, his voice trembling. "Was there really a baby?" "My daughter turns 5 next month," Louisa replied, the coolness in her voice softening slightly as she spoke of the girl. "She is brilliant, determined, and completely loved." Richard nodded slowly, digesting the information. "Is she mine? Biologically?" "Yes." "In all the other senses that matter?" "No." The firmness returned to Louisa's voice. "But I'm not here to discuss paternity. I'm here to close a deal and to demand justice for my great-aunt." Understanding finally dawned on Richard's exhausted face. "Amelia is your aunt, the woman who took me in when I lost everything, the woman whose talent your family exploited for decades." Louisa returned to the table, gathering the documents with precise gestures. "My proposal remains the same, a fair value for what is left of your empire, with the condition of public and permanent recognition of Amelia's contribution." There was something in the dignity with which she was conducting that moment that touched Richard deeply. It wasn't revenge he saw in those familiar yet transformed eyes. It was an almost serene determination, the clarity of purpose of someone who had completed a journey of self-discovery. "You could have destroyed everything," he observed. "You could have publicly exposed the plagiarism, completely ruined what is left of the Montero name." Louisa smiled, a genuine smile this time. "Destruction is easy, Richard. Building or rebuilding is the real challenge." She held out her hand, offering a pen. "So, do we have a deal?" 5 years after that fateful day in the cathedral, the dinner table in the penthouse of the now renamed Aurora Group's main restaurant brought together 3 generations. Victoria, almost turning 5, was drawing with concentration as she savored a handmade Jussara ice cream. Aunt Amelia, at 92, watched the city illuminated below, her name now engraved on a bronze plaque at the entrance and printed prominently on the menus that circulated the world. Louisa, who now answered to that name as much as to Aurora, depending on the context, contemplated the two of them silently, a feeling of completeness filling her as she had never experienced. The journey had not been easy. The ownership transition, the public recognition of Amelia, the complete restructuring of the operations, each step required unshakable determination and tireless work. Richard fulfilled his part of the agreement. After the sale, he left to start over in another country, freed from the weight of secrets and lies that had imprisoned him. Before leaving, he asked to meet Victoria, a brief, silent encounter that Louisa allowed, not for him, but for the daughter who might one day ask questions. "Mommy, look what I drew," Victoria exclaimed, holding up a colorful paper. The child's drawing showed 3 figures holding hands in front of what appeared to be the restaurant. Her, Louisa and Aunt Amelia. "It's beautiful, my love," Louisa replied, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "Our family." When Victoria returned to her dessert, Louisa discreetly opened her purse, taking out the golden envelope that had accompanied her through every step of her transformation. Inside, no longer the devastating message of abandonment, but the official deeds that transferred the entire gastronomic empire to her name. The same paper with the Montero crest, now overlaid with the seal of her own company. "A cycle complete," Aunt Amelia observed, who had noticed the gesture. Louisa nodded, putting the envelope away again. "It's not about destiny. It's about the choices we make when we face adversity." As night fell over the city, the 3 generations of women remained united in that space that symbolized not only business success, but the extraordinary journey of a woman who had transformed the greatest humiliation of her life into the foundation of her greatest achievement. "To the future," Louisa toasted, raising her glass to Amelia. "To the stories we choose to write," the old woman replied, her eyes shining with wisdom and pride. Down below, the city continued its incessant rhythm, indifferent to the personal dramas that unfolded in its skyscrapers and alleys. But at that table under the stars, 3 hearts beat in perfect synchrony, past, present, and future, intertwined in a narrative of resilience, authenticity, and the transformative power of genuine love.